The sound of a gunshot cracked through the air, sending a flock of birds scattering from the trees along the riverbank. Ruby Zimmerman flinched, her hand tightening around the leather satchel clutched to her chest. She hadn't expected trouble so close to Silver Creek, but then again, trouble had a way of finding her no matter where she went. It was 1878, and the West was still wild enough that a woman traveling alone invited all manner of danger. Ruby had known this when she'd left Philadelphia 3 weeks ago, but desperation had a way of making even the most dangerous paths seem worth taking. "Hold right there, miss," came a gruff voice from behind the rocky outcropping ahead. "That's far enough." Ruby felt her heart hammering against her ribs as a man stepped out onto the trail. He wore a dusty black hat pulled low over his eyes, a bandana covering the lower half of his face. The revolver in his hand gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. "I don't have anything of value," Ruby said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the tremor in her limbs. "That fancy bag says otherwise," the man replied, gesturing with his gun. "Hand it over and maybe I'll let you keep on breathing." Ruby took a step backward. The satchel contained all she had left in the world: the deed to her uncle's property, the last of her money, and the locket with her parents' portraits. Without it, she had nothing. "I said hand it over." The man took a threatening step forward. Ruby turned and ran. She heard the man curse behind her, followed by the sound of heavy boots pounding the dirt. She knew she couldn't outrun him, but the river was just beyond the tree line to her right. If she could reach it, perhaps she could lose him somehow. Breaking through the trees, Ruby skidded down the embankment. The current looked stronger than she'd anticipated, the water higher and faster from the spring melt. She hesitated for only a moment before plunging in, gasping as the icy water hit her skin. The sudden cold shocked her body, making it hard to breathe as she struggled against the current. Her skirts immediately became waterlogged, dragging her down as she attempted to swim. She'd been a strong swimmer back home in the calm waters of the lake near her family's estate, but this was different. This was a living thing, angry and powerful. Damn foolish woman. She heard the outlaw shout from the shore, but she was already being pulled away by the current, her head occasionally dipping below the surface as she fought to stay afloat. Ruby realized her mistake too late. The river was too strong, the water too cold. Her limbs began to feel heavy, her movements sluggish as the current carried her downstream. She managed to clutch the satchel to her chest with one hand while the other flailed uselessly against the rushing water. "Help." She called out, though she doubted anyone would hear her over the roar of the river. "Please, someone help." The current slammed her against a partially submerged boulder, knocking the breath from her lungs. She gasped in pain, inadvertently drawing in water. Coughing and spluttering, Ruby felt her grip on the satchel loosening as the river pulled her down, the world above disappearing as water closed over her head. Just as darkness began to creep in at the edges of her vision, someone grabbed her arm. Strong hands gripped her firmly, pulling her up toward the surface. Ruby was barely conscious as her head broke through the water, her lungs burning as she coughed and gasped for air. "I've got you," a deep voice said close to her ear. "Hold on." Her rescuer swam powerfully toward the shore, one arm around her waist while the other cut through the water. Ruby could do little more than hold on, her strength nearly gone. As they neared the riverbank, she noticed the fiery glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across the water. The beautiful orange and pink hues seemed at odds with her brush with death. When they finally reached the shallows, the man stood, lifting her in his arms as if she weighed nothing. Through her water-logged vision, Ruby saw a handsome face etched with concern, dark hair plastered to his forehead, and intense blue eyes that studied her with worry. "Can you breathe all right, madam?" he asked, laying her gently on the grassy bank. Ruby nodded, still coughing up river water. "Thank you," she managed between gasps. "You saved my life." "Name's Jackson Dawson," he said, kneeling beside her. "Most folks call me Jack. What in God's name were you doing swimming in the Silverstone this time of year? That river's treacherous even in summer." I wasn't swimming, Ruby said, pushing herself up on her elbows. I was running. Suddenly, she remembered the satchel. Her hands flew to her sides, panic rising in her chest. My bag, it's gone. Jack looked back toward the river, shading his eyes against the setting sun. That leather thing. I saw it floating downstream when I pulled you out. Couldn't grab both you and it. Ruby felt tears spring to her eyes. Everything she had, everything she'd come west for was gone. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Jack shifted uncomfortably beside her. Look, miss. Ruby, she supplied through her tears. Ruby Zimmerman, Miss Zimmerman, I don't know what was in that bag, but it can't be worth your life. Ruby wiped her eyes with trembling hands. It was everything. The deed to my uncle's ranch, all my money, my parents' locket, everything. Jack sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his wet hair. Well, you're alive, and that's what matters. The river sometimes gives back what it takes. We can look for your things come morning. Ruby looked up at him, really seeing him for the first time. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a strong jaw dusted with stubble. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy: denim pants, a simple shirt, and a leather vest that had seen better days. A gun belt was strapped to his hips, though the holster was empty. Where did you come from? She asked, realizing she hadn't seen anyone else nearby before she'd entered the water. Was tracking a stray calf when I heard the commotion, Jack explained, gesturing toward a horse grazing a few yards away. Saw you go under just as I was coming around the bend. Ruby suddenly became aware of her soaked clothing clinging to her body. She crossed her arms over her chest, feeling exposed despite being fully dressed. Jack noticed her discomfort and quickly shrugged out of his leather vest, draping it over her shoulders. My cabin's not far. We should get you dry before night falls. These mountains get mighty cold after sunset. I can't impose, Ruby protested weakly, though she had nowhere else to go. Madam, you nearly drowned. I'm not about to leave you out here to freeze. Jack stood and offered her his hand. Can you walk? Ruby took his hand, allowing him to help her to her feet. Her legs felt wobbly, and her soaked skirts weighed her down, but she managed to stay upright. Thank you, Mr. Dawson. Just Jack, he corrected, leading her toward his horse. Mr. Dawson was my father, and he's been gone these 10 years now. Jack helped Ruby onto his horse before mounting behind her. She felt the solid warmth of his chest against her back as he reached around her to take the reins, and despite her recent trauma, she found herself drawing comfort from his presence. As they rode away from the river, Ruby glanced back at the water, now shimmering gold and crimson in the last light of day. The same river that had nearly claimed her life now looked deceptively peaceful, meandering through the landscape as if it had never tried to drown her. Your accent's not from around here, Jack observed as they rode. Philadelphia, Ruby replied. I arrived in Silver Creek 3 days ago, long way from home. I have no home anymore, she said softly. That's why I came west. My uncle Elias Zimmerman died and left me his ranch. It was my last hope. Jack was silent for a moment. Elias Zimmerman, of the Lazy Z, Ruby turned slightly to look at him. You knew him. Everyone knew old Elias, Jack said. Tough as nails, but fair. I'm sorry for your loss. I never met him, Ruby admitted. He and my father had a falling out before I was born, but when my parents died of influenza last winter and the bank took our home. She trailed off, the memory still too painful. And now the deed's gone, Jack finished for her. Ruby nodded, fighting back fresh tears. Without it, I have no claim to the property. We'll figure something out, Jack said, his voice firm with a confidence Ruby couldn't share. The county office might have records, and like I said, we'll search the riverbank tomorrow. They rode in silence for a while, winding through stands of pine and aspen. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the mountains by the time a small cabin came into view, nestled in a clearing with a corral and barn nearby. It's not much, Jack said as he helped Ruby dismount, but it's dry and warm. Ruby looked at the modest cabin with its stone chimney and small covered porch. It was simple but well-maintained, with split firewood neatly stacked against one wall and a small garden plot to the side. "It's lovely," she said sincerely. Jack led his horse to the corral before ushering Ruby inside. The cabin was a single room with a stone fireplace, a small table with 2 chairs, a cupboard for provisions, and a bed in the corner. It was sparse but tidy, with none of the empty bottles or other unsavory items Ruby had feared might decorate a bachelor's dwelling. "Let me get a fire going," Jack said, kneeling by the hearth. "You need to get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death." Ruby wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly uncertain. "I don't have anything else to wear." Jack seemed to realize the predicament. He stood and went to a trunk at the foot of the bed, pulling out a flannel shirt and a pair of trousers that looked far too big for her. "These will swim on you, but they're clean and dry," he said, handing them to her. "I'll step outside while you change." True to his word, Jack left the cabin, closing the door firmly behind him. Ruby changed quickly, her fingers clumsy with cold as she struggled with the buttons of her dress. The borrowed clothes were indeed much too large, but they were warm and smelled of soap and pine. She was rolling up the sleeves of the shirt when Jack knocked lightly on the door. "Decent," he called. "Yes, thank you," Ruby answered, hastily gathering her wet garments. Jack entered, carrying an armful of kindling. He paused when he saw her, a strange expression crossing his face before he quickly looked away and busied himself with the fire. "We can hang your things to dry," he said, nodding toward a length of rope strung across one corner of the room. "Might take till morning, though." Ruby hung her dress and undergarments, feeling a flush of embarrassment at having her intimate clothing on display. Jack, to his credit, kept his attention focused on the fire, which was now crackling to life. "Are you hungry?" he asked once the fire was blazing steadily. Ruby hadn't thought about food, but at the mention of it, her stomach growled loudly. She hadn't eaten since a meager breakfast at the boarding house in Silver Creek. "I have some stew left from yesterday," Jack offered. "It's not fancy, but it's filling." "That sounds wonderful," Ruby said gratefully. Jack busied himself with the stew while Ruby sat on a stool near the fire, holding her hands out to the warmth. Now that the immediate danger had passed, she found herself struggling to process all that had happened. Yesterday, she had been full of hope, setting out to claim her inheritance and start a new life. Now she was stranded with a stranger, everything she owned lost to the river. "Here," Jack said, handing her a steaming bowl. "Careful, it's hot." Ruby accepted the bowl and spoon, inhaling the savory aroma. "Thank you for everything. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Jack settled into a chair across from her with his own bowl. Just happened to be in the right place at the right time. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional howl of a coyote in the distance. "So," Jack said eventually, "you said you were running when you went into the river." "Running from what?" Ruby set down her spoon, her appetite suddenly diminishing. "A man tried to rob me on the trail. I panicked and ran." Jack's expression hardened. "Can you describe him?" He wore a bandana over his face, black hat, not very tall but wiry. His voice was rough. Ruby shuddered at the memory. "Sounds like it could be one of the Haskell boys," Jack muttered. "They've been causing trouble around these parts for months now." "Will he come looking for me, do you think?" Ruby asked, a new fear gripping her. Jack shook his head. "Not likely. The Haskells are cowards at heart. Besides, he probably thinks the river took you." The thought was chilling. Ruby set her bowl aside, suddenly exhausted. The events of the day caught up with her all at once, and she swayed slightly on her stool. Jack was at her side in an instant, steadying her with a hand on her shoulder. "You're dead on your feet. Take the bed, I'll make a pallet by the fire." "I couldn't possibly, I insist," Jack said firmly. "You've been through enough today." Too tired to argue, Ruby allowed him to guide her to the bed in the corner. The mattress was stuffed with straw but covered with clean linens that smelled of sunshine. Jack draped a quilt over her as she lay down. "Rest now," he said softly. "Things will look better in the morning." Ruby wanted to thank him again, but sleep was already pulling her under. the gentle crackling of the fire lulling her into darkness. She dreamed of the river, of being pulled down into its cold depths, struggling for air. But in her dream, there was no one to save her, no strong arms to pull her back to the surface. She thrashed against the current, her lungs burning, darkness closing in. "Ruby, Ruby, wake up, you're dreaming." She gasped awake to find Jack leaning over her, his face etched with concern in the dim light of the dying fire. "You were having a nightmare," he explained. Stepping back now that she was awake, Ruby sat up, pushing her tangled hair away from her face. "I was back in the river," she whispered. Jack nodded in understanding. It'll take time for those memories to fade. Ruby noticed he was fully dressed, with his hat already on his head. Outside, the first gray light of dawn was visible through the cabin's single window. "You're going somewhere?" she asked. "Thought I'd ride along the river, see if I can find your satchel," Jack explained. "Sometimes things wash up on the sandbars downstream." Hope flared in Ruby's chest. "Let me come with you." Jack hesitated. "It's a long ride and you've been through a lot. Please," Ruby insisted. "I need to do something. I can't just sit here and wait." Jack studied her for a moment before nodding. "All right, your clothes should be dry by now. I'll saddle the horses while you get ready." "Horses, plural?" Ruby asked. "Got an old mare that can carry you. She's gentle enough." Jack headed for the door. "There's water in the basin if you want to wash up. Take your time." Once alone, Ruby quickly dressed in her now dry clothes, grateful to be back in her own garments despite their wrinkled state. She splashed cold water on her face and did her best to tame her hair without a proper brush. Outside, the morning air was crisp and cool, the sky brightening with the promise of sunrise. Jack was leading 2 horses from the barn, his own sturdy gelding and an older bay mare with a white blaze down her face. "This is Penny," Jack said, patting the mare's neck. "She's seen a lot of years, but she's sure-footed." Ruby approached the horse, letting Penny sniff her hand before gently stroking her velvety nose. "She's beautiful." Jack helped Ruby mount, then swung up onto his own horse. They set off toward the river, following a narrow trail that wound through stands of pine and aspen. The morning was quiet except for the occasional bird call and the steady rhythm of hooves on the packed earth. "How long have you lived out here?" Ruby asked as they rode. "Going on 5 years now," Jack replied. "Worked as a ranch hand for a spell before that, saved up enough to buy this place." "It must get lonely being so far from town." Jack was quiet for a moment. "I prefer the quiet. Towns have too many people with too many opinions." There was a story there, Ruby thought, but she didn't press. Everyone who came west seemed to be running from something or toward something, and Jack Dawson didn't strike her as a man who shared his past easily. They reached the river about an hour after setting out. It looked different in the morning light, less menacing, but no less powerful. Jack led them downstream, following the current's path. "Keep your eyes peeled for anything caught in the branches along the bank," he instructed. "River tends to deposit things in the bends and shallows." They rode for miles, scanning both sides of the river. Ruby's hope began to fade as the morning wore on with no sign of her satchel. By midday, they had traveled several miles downstream, and Jack suggested they stop to rest the horses. "Don't give up yet," he said, noticing her dejected expression. "River's tricky. Might have carried it further than we think." Ruby nodded, though she was beginning to accept that her belongings might be lost forever. They continued their search after a brief rest, but by late afternoon, Jack reluctantly suggested they turn back. "We can try again tomorrow," he offered. "Maybe check some of the other bends we missed." Ruby was about to agree when something caught her eye, a flash of something dark snagged on a fallen tree that jutted into the water about 20 yards downstream. "Jack," she exclaimed, pointing, "there's something there." Jack followed her gaze, squinting against the afternoon sun. "Stay here," he said, dismounting and handing her his reins. Ruby watched anxiously as Jack made his way down to the water's edge and carefully navigated out onto the fallen tree. He balanced precariously, reaching for whatever was caught in the branches. For one heart-stopping moment, he almost slipped, and Ruby gasped, terrified he would fall into the same currents that had nearly claimed her life. But Jack maintained his footing and managed to grab the object. When he turned back toward her, holding it up, Ruby's heart leaped in her chest. "My satchel," she cried, hardly daring to believe it. Jack made his way back to shore, examining the waterlogged leather bag as he walked. "It's taken a beating," he said as he approached, "but it's intact." Ruby practically fell from her horse in her haste to take the satchel from him. The leather was sodden and stained, but when she fumbled with the clasp and opened it, she found the contents remarkably preserved. The documents were damp around the edges but legible, protected by the oilcloth wrapper she'd placed them in. Her money pouch was still there, and at the bottom, wrapped in a handkerchief, was her mother's locket. Tears sprang to Ruby's eyes as she clutched the locket to her chest. "It's all here," she whispered. "Everything." Jack smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines and lighting his eyes. "Told you the river sometimes gives back what it takes." The ride back to Jack's cabin was considerably more cheerful than the outward journey had been. Ruby found herself talking more freely, telling Jack about her life in Philadelphia, her father's shipping business that had failed after his death, leaving her mother and her destitute. She spoke of her mother's illness and death, and how she discovered the letter from her uncle among her father's papers, offering Ruby a home if she ever needed one. "By the time I found it, Uncle Elias was already dead," Ruby explained. "But his lawyer wrote that the property had passed to me as his only living relative. It seemed like providence." Jack listened attentively, asking occasional questions but mostly just letting her talk. As they neared his cabin, the sun was once again setting, bathing the landscape in golden light. "We should ride into town tomorrow," Jack suggested as they dismounted. "Get those papers filed properly at the county office, and you'll want to see the property, I expect." Ruby nodded, suddenly nervous about what lay ahead. "Will you? Would you mind coming with me, to the ranch, I mean?" "I don't know anything about ranching, and I'd be happy to," Jack interrupted gently. "Truth be told, I was going to offer anyway. The Lazy Z is a good spread, but it's been sitting empty since Elias passed. Might need some work to get it back in shape." Relief flooded through Ruby. "Thank you. I don't know how I'll ever repay you for all your kindness." Jack shook his head as he led the horses toward the corral. "No need for that. Neighbors help neighbors out here. That's just the way of it." That night, after another simple but satisfying meal, Ruby sat by the fire, carefully drying the damp documents from her satchel. Jack had gone outside to check on the horses one last time before retiring, giving her a few moments of solitude. She unfolded the deed to the Lazy Z, tracing her finger over her uncle's signature. Tomorrow, she would see her inheritance for the first time, the land that was meant to be her fresh start. The thought both excited and terrified her. The door opened and Jack stepped inside, bringing with him the cool night air and the scent of pine. He hung his hat on a peg by the door and came to sit across from her. "Everything dry out all right?" he asked, nodding toward the papers. "Yes, thankfully," Ruby said. "The important parts are still legible." Jack nodded, his gaze lingering on her face in a way that made her heart beat a little faster. There was something in his expression she couldn't quite read, a mixture of admiration and something deeper. "You're a brave woman, Ruby Zimmerman," he said finally. "Coming all this way on your own, facing down whatever life throws at you. Most folks would have given up after what happened yesterday." Ruby felt a blush rising to her cheeks. "I'm not brave, just desperate." "Desperation makes cowards run," Jack countered. "It makes the brave fight harder." They fell silent, the crackling of the fire filling the space between them. Ruby found herself studying Jack's profile in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the small scar near his left eyebrow, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. He was handsome in a rugged, understated way that was entirely different from the polished gentleman she'd known back east. "I should let you get some rest," Jack said eventually, rising from his chair. "Tomorrow will be a long day." "Jack," Ruby said, impulsively reaching out to catch his hand. I never properly thanked you for saving my life." He looked down at their joined hands, his expression softening. "You don't need to thank me, Ruby." "But I do," she insisted. "If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't seen me and dived in." She shuddered at the thought. "I owe you everything." Jack gently squeezed her hand before releasing it. "Get some sleep. We'll head to town first thing in the morning." As Ruby lay in bed that night, listening to Jack's steady breathing from his pallet by the fire, she found herself contemplating the strange twists of fate that had brought her here. The river had nearly taken her life, but in doing so, it had also led her to Jack Dawson. She wondered what else fate had in store for her in this wild, beautiful country that was to be her new home. The next morning dawned clear and bright. After a breakfast of cornbread and coffee, they set out for Silver Creek, a journey that took the better part of the morning. The town was much as Ruby remembered from her brief stay, a single dusty main street lined with wooden buildings, the most prominent being the Gold Nugget Saloon and the Silver Creek Hotel, where she'd stayed upon her arrival. Their first stop was the county clerk's office, a small room at the back of the general store where a bespectacled man named Harrison processed all manner of official business for the county. "Miss Zimmerman," he greeted her with genuine surprise. "I'd heard you'd left town. Thought you'd given up on claiming the Lazy Z." "Not at all," Ruby replied, presenting her now dried documents. "I was delayed by an incident on the trail." Harrison examined the deed and letters, humming thoughtfully. "Everything seems in order." Elias was clear about his wishes. "The property is yours." He pulled out a large ledger. "Just need to make it official in the county records." While Harrison meticulously copied the information from the deed, Ruby glanced at Jack, who was standing near the door, his hat in his hands. He gave her an encouraging nod. "There we are," Harrison said finally, blotting the ink. "Congratulations, Miss Zimmerman. You are now the official owner of the Lazy Z Ranch." Ruby felt a surge of emotion, relief, excitement, and a touch of fear. It was real now. She owned land, a ranch, a future here in this rugged country so different from the city she'd left behind. "Mr. Dawson," Harrison continued, looking at Jack, "good to see you in town, been a while." "Just helping Miss Zimmerman get settled," Jack replied. "Thought we might ride out to the Lazy Z today, let her see the place." Harrison nodded approvingly. "Good idea. Place has been sitting empty too long. Shame to see good land go to waste." He turned back to Ruby. "You're lucky to have Jack helping you, Miss Zimmerman. No better man to show you the ropes." Their next stop was the general store, where Ruby purchased supplies for the ranch, basic provisions, some cooking utensils, and a few other necessities. Jack quietly added items to her list, practical things she wouldn't have thought of, like lamp oil and matches. "The house should be sound," he told her as they loaded their purchases onto the horses. "Elias built it to last. But it'll need a good cleaning and probably some repairs after sitting empty all winter." As they prepared to leave town, a commotion near the sheriff's office caught their attention. A crowd had gathered, watching as two men were led in handcuffs toward the jailhouse. "The Haskell brothers," Jack murmured, his expression darkening. "Looks like the sheriff finally caught up with them." Ruby felt a chill as she recognized one of the men as her would-be robber from the trail. "What will happen to them?" "Judge comes through every few months," Jack explained. "They'll stand trial for robbery and who knows what else. Likely end up in territorial prison for a good long while." Ruby couldn't summon any sympathy for the men. If not for their actions, she wouldn't have ended up in the river, but she also wouldn't have met Jack. The thought gave her pause as they rode out of town, heading west toward the foothills where the Lazy Z was located. The ranch came into view in the late afternoon, a sprawling property nestled in a verdant valley with mountains rising behind it. A weathered sign bearing a stylized Z marked the entrance to the property. Beyond it, Ruby could see a substantial log house, a large barn, several outbuildings and corrals. In the distance, grassy pastures stretched to the base of the foothills. "It's beautiful," Ruby breathed as they rode through the gate. "Elias chose well," Jack agreed. Good water, sheltered from the worst of the winter storms, plenty of grazing land. He ran about 200 head of cattle before he got sick. Where are they now? Ruby asked, noticing the empty corrals. Neighbors divided up the herd after he passed to keep them fed and cared for. Your property, so they'll be returned now that you're here to claim them. As they approached the house, Ruby felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. This was to be her home, yet it belonged to a man she'd never met, a relative who was a stranger to her. The house was larger than she'd expected, built of solid logs with a stone foundation and a wide, covered porch. Jack tied the horses to the hitching post and helped Ruby dismount. "Let's see what we're working with," he said, leading the way up the porch steps. The front door was locked, but Jack retrieved a key from under a loose board on the porch. Elias always kept it there, he explained, and opened the door. Inside, the house was dusty but otherwise well preserved. Heavy furniture built to last filled the main room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by bookshelves filled with volumes that had belonged to her uncle. "Kitchen's through there," Jack said, gesturing to a doorway. "Bedroom's in the back. It's a solid house." Ruby wandered through the rooms, trailing her fingers over surfaces, trying to connect with the uncle she'd never known through the home he'd created. In his bedroom, she found a small portrait on the bedside table, a man with her father's eyes and her grandmother's strong chin. Elias Zimmerman looked stern but not unkind in the photograph. "I wish I'd known him," she said softly when Jack appeared in the doorway. "He was a good man," Jack replied, "fair and honest, helped me when I first came to these parts." Ruby turned to face him. "Will you tell me about him?" "About what he was like," Jack nodded. "While we work. There's plenty to do if you want to sleep here tonight." The next few hours were spent cleaning the main rooms of the house, airing out bedding, and getting the kitchen stove working. As they worked, Jack shared stories of Elias Zimmerman, how he'd come west as a young man, built the ranch from nothing, earned the respect of everyone in the valley, both white and Native American. "He never married?" Ruby asked as she swept years of dust from the kitchen floor. "No," Jack replied, carrying in firewood for the stove. "There was talk of a sweetheart back east who died young. He never spoke of it himself." Ruby wondered if that sweetheart had been connected to the rift between Elias and her father. Perhaps someday she would uncover the full story. By sunset, they had the house in reasonable order. Jack lit the lamps while Ruby prepared a simple meal from the supplies they'd purchased in town. They ate at the heavy oak table that had belonged to her uncle, the silence comfortable between them. "I should head back to my place," Jack said after they'd washed the dishes. "Let you settle in." Ruby felt a sudden panic at the thought of being alone in the unfamiliar house. "Could you? Would you mind staying, just for tonight? I'm not sure I'm ready to be here alone yet." Jack hesitated, clearly weighing propriety against her obvious discomfort. "I could sleep in the barn," he suggested. "There's a second bedroom," Ruby pointed out. "It would be perfectly respectable." After a moment, Jack nodded. "All right, just for tonight." That night, lying in her uncle's bed, her bed now, Ruby found sleep elusive. The house made unfamiliar sounds, creaking and settling in the darkness. Knowing Jack was just across the hall brought comfort, but it also stirred something else within her, a growing awareness of him not just as her rescuer, but as a man. In the morning, Jack helped her draw up a list of tasks that needed attention around the ranch: repairs to the barn roof, mending fences, clearing out the chicken coop, preparing the garden for planting. The list was daunting, but Jack assured her they could tackle it together over the coming weeks. "You don't need to do all this," Ruby protested. "You've already done so much." "I don't mind," Jack replied simply. "Besides, I promised Elias I'd look after the place if anything happened to him, just keeping my word." That surprised her. "You and my uncle were close." Jack nodded, his expression solemn. "He gave me a chance when others wouldn't. I owe him." There was more to the story, Ruby sensed, but Jack changed the subject, suggesting they ride the property lines so she could get a better sense of her land. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Jack would arrive early each morning, and they would work together on the endless tasks required to bring the ranch back to life. He taught her about cattle and horses, about the rhythms of ranch life, about surviving in this beautiful but unforgiving country. Neighbors began to visit, curious about Elias Zimmerman's niece from back east. They brought welcome gifts, jars of preserves, freshly baked bread, a laying hen. The Wilcox family from the neighboring ranch promised to help drive her cattle back to the Lazy Z once the spring branding was complete. Mrs. Sanchez from the small farm down the valley brought seedlings for Ruby's garden and stayed to help her plant them. "Jack Dawson is a good man," Mrs. Sanchez commented as they worked side by side in the freshly turned earth. "He has been alone too long." Ruby felt herself blushing. "He's been very kind to help me." Mrs. Sanchez gave her a knowing look. "It is more than kindness I see in his eyes when he looks at you." Ruby had noticed it too, the way Jack's gaze sometimes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, the careful way he kept a respectful distance between them even as they worked closely together day after day. There was an attraction building between them, unspoken but undeniable. As spring deepened into early summer, the Lazy Z began to thrive under their care. The cattle were returned to the pastures, the garden began producing vegetables, and the repairs to the buildings were nearly complete. Ruby found herself growing stronger, more capable with each passing day. The city girl from Philadelphia was slowly transforming into a woman who could manage a ranch, who could ride for hours without tiring, who could face whatever challenges the West threw at her. And through it all, Jack was there, teaching, encouraging, becoming increasingly essential to her life in ways that went beyond practical help. One evening in late June, they sat on the porch after a long day's work, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Jack had brought a bottle of whiskey to celebrate the completion of the new corral, and they each had a small glass. "I've been thinking," Jack said after a comfortable silence. "With the ranch running smoothly now, you probably don't need my help much longer." Ruby felt her heart sink. Are you saying you won't be coming around anymore?" Jack swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "Just saying you're doing fine on your own now, learning fast, figured you might want your independence." "Jack," Ruby said softly, gathering her courage, "the truth is I've grown accustomed to having you here." He looked at her then, his blue eyes searching her face. "Accustomed?" Ruby set her glass aside and turned to face him fully. "More than accustomed, I've grown to care for you very much." Jack set his own glass down, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "Ruby, you should know something about me, about why I live alone, why folks in town treat me the way they do." Ruby waited, her heart pounding in her chest. "I killed a man," Jack said, the words falling between them like stones. 6 years ago in a saloon in Deerville. He cheated at cards, pulled a gun when I called him on it. I was faster." Ruby took a shaky breath. "Self-defense, then." "The law saw it that way," Jack nodded, "but his family didn't. His brother was the town marshal, made it clear I wasn't welcome to stay, so I drifted, ended up here. Your uncle knew my story, gave me a chance anyway." He paused, looking out at the darkening landscape. "But some folks have long memories and loose tongues. The story followed me. That's why I keep to myself. Don't want to bring trouble to your door." Ruby considered his words carefully before responding. "Jack, I didn't come west expecting life to be easy or people to be perfect. I came for a fresh start. Isn't that what the West is supposed to be about? Second chances?" "Some things follow you," Jack warned. Ruby reached out, placing her hand over his. "Then we faced them together." Jack looked down at their joined hands, then back up to her face. Slowly, he turned his hand to lace his fingers with hers. "Ruby Zimmerman," he said softly, "you are the most surprising woman I've ever met." Ruby smiled. "Is that a good thing?" "The best thing," he replied, leaning closer. The kiss, when it came, was gentle at first, a tentative question. Ruby answered by sliding her free hand to the back of his neck, drawing him closer. The kiss deepened, becoming a declaration neither of them had fully put into words until now, when they finally parted. The sky had darkened to deep blue. the first stars appearing overhead. "I've been wanting to do that since I pulled you from that river," Jack admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been wanting you to," Ruby confessed, "for almost as long. As summer blossomed across the valley, so did their relationship." Jack continued to help at the Lazy Z, but now there were shared meals, lingering touches, stolen kisses between tasks. Ruby flourished under his tutelage and the ranch prospered. The locals began to accept her as one of their own, particularly when they saw how she and Jack were together. In July, during a particularly hot spell, Jack suggested they ride up to a hidden lake in the foothills where they could cool off. They packed a picnic and spent the day swimming in the crystal clear water and lounging in the shade of pine trees. It was there, with water droplets still glistening in her hair and the scent of pine heavy in the air, that Jack first told Ruby he loved her. "I never expected to find someone like you," he said, cradling her face in his hands. "Never thought I deserved it after everything." "Love isn't about deserving," Ruby replied, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "It just is, and I love you, Jackson Dawson, with all my heart." They were married in September when the aspen leaves had turned to gold and the air carried the first hints of autumn. The ceremony was held on the porch of the Lazy Z, with neighbors and friends gathered to witness their vows. Ruby wore a simple cream-colored dress ordered from Denver, with wildflowers in her hair. Jack wore a new shirt and vest, his boots polished to a shine. After the ceremony and celebration, when the guests had departed and twilight wrapped the valley in soft purple shadows, they stood together on the porch of what was now their home. "Happy?" Jack asked, his arm around her waist. Ruby leaned her head against his shoulder. "More than I ever thought possible." She turned in his embrace to face him. "Do you ever think about how close we came to never meeting, if I hadn't run from that robber, if I hadn't fallen into the river? If I hadn't been tracking that stray calf at exactly that moment," Jack added, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "The river pulled me down," Ruby mused, "and you dove in and brought me up, gasping beneath the setting sun. It was the worst moment of my life and the best, all at once." Jack kissed her forehead. "I'd dive into 100 rivers to find you, Ruby Dawson." In the years that followed, the Lazy Z thrived under their joint care. Jack's knowledge of ranching and Ruby's sharp business mind proved to be a formidable combination. They expanded the herd, improved the bloodlines, and the Lazy Z cattle began fetching top prices at market. Their first child, a daughter they named Alina after Ruby's mother, was born the following summer. A son, William, named for Jack's father, followed 2 years later. The house that had once seemed too large for Ruby alone now rang with children's laughter and the busy sounds of family life. On the 5th anniversary of the day Jack had pulled Ruby from the river, they rode together to the spot where their story had begun. The river was calm that day, sunlight dancing on its surface, belying its dangerous currents. "It looks so peaceful," Ruby observed as they stood on the bank, hand in hand. "Hard to believe it nearly took my life." "Nature's like that," Jack replied, "beautiful and deadly at the same time." "Like this whole country." Ruby squeezed his hand. "Like love sometimes, terrifying and wonderful." Jack smiled, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening lines earned from years of squinting in the sun, from laughter, from a life fully lived. "I wouldn't change a thing, you know. Not one moment of our story." Ruby leaned into him, content in a way she'd never imagined possible when she'd first set out from Philadelphia all those years ago. "Neither would I, even the river." "Especially the river," Jack murmured, drawing her into his arms. As they stood there together, the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The same setting sun that had witnessed their beginning now blessed the life they had built together, a life born from danger and rescue, from courage and second chances, from a river that had tried to take everything but had ultimately given Ruby more than she could have ever dreamed.